India is in the grip of an uncommonly long series of heat waves that began in March. As per the Indian Met Department, the average maximum temperature recorded in March was the highest since 1901. It comes after the extreme heat in March last year, which was the third warmest on record. In the month of April, the temperatures in parts of Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra were recorded in the range of 44 to 47 degrees Celsius. Rajasthan, Haryana, Delhi, Madhya Pradesh, Telangana, and Punjab also recorded temperatures in the range of 42 to 45 degrees Celsius. This is the weekly fix. I'm Smitha Nair. So, what exactly is a heat wave? The Indian Met Department states that qualitatively, a heat wave is a condition of air temperature which becomes fatal when the human body is exposed to it. This is how it's measured. If the maximum temperature of a station reaches 40 degrees Celsius or more for the plains and at least 30 degrees Celsius or more for hilly regions, and the departure from normal is 4.5 degrees Celsius, it is a heat wave. Needless to say, extreme heat conditions have a disproportionate impact on the poor and marginalized. Those working long hours outdoors, like in farming or construction, are worst hit. The IPCC sixth assessment report has warned that India will suffer more frequent and intense heat waves, extreme rainfall events, and erratic monsoons, as well as more cyclonic activity, among other weather related calamities. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a UN body that provides policy makers with regular scientific assessments on climate change, its implications, and sort of suggests adaptation and mitigation options. Now, the second installment of that IPCC report that I referred to warns that globally, heat and humidity will create conditions beyond human tolerance if emissions are not rapidly eliminated. India is among the places that will experience those intolerable conditions. So, what's being done? Let's speak to senior environmental journalist Bahar Dutt. Bahar has reported extensively on negotiations and deliberations at the UN climate change conferences and closely tracks climate policy. She's a former colleague as well. Thanks for making the time, Bahar.
It's a pleasure to be here, Smitha. Thanks for having me on the Weekly Fix.
Bahar, we've seen the heat wave in India being described by meteorological experts as early, severe, and more frequent. What do you find most notable about this ongoing heat wave, and can you sort of talk about what is likely causing it? And is it as clear as can be that global warming is now decidedly affecting ambient temperatures?
Well, Smita, the situation of India is unique in the sense that a lot of Western modeling, when I say Western modeling, what I mean is the predictions that are done as far as climate change is concerned and its impact on global warming, they tend to be more accurate. For India, it's a peculiar situation simply because of our regional placement, the impact that the monsoons have on our weather conditions. That said, as you just rightly quoted the IPCC, most of the predictions that scientists have been saying there'll be extreme weather conditions, their intensity will increase, their frequency will increase. All that is matching with what we are seeing play out at the moment. Scientists will say that we can't attribute individual events to global warming. Most scientists, if you talk to them, will always say that as a rider, that I can't say that this particular event is global warming, but the overall broad pattern suggests that we are in the midst of rising temperatures, and the data itself suggests it. You have to just step out. My background looks beautiful, but you step out on the road, you talk to the person on the street, and they know this is global warming.
Right. Bahar, my sort of engagement with climate science assessments, etc., is episodic, as with most journalists. There was COP26, so I sort of read up everything there was to read. And now, of course, this IPCC report, second installment. There's a term that I was unfamiliar with, and I'm sure many of our viewers are too. I wanted to ask you what it is: wet bulb temperatures. What does that
Yeah.
mean? And is there sort of a threshold beyond which it would be considered sort of unlivable? And as any part of India sort of reaching that threshold?
Yes. So I'm glad you picked that up. So not just the wet bulb temperature. Let's take a step back. What is the IPCC? The IPCC really is, it's a conglomerate of scientists who come together every few years, and there are topics, whether it's adaptation, mitigation, and they come out with reports. But it's not like they're doing any fresh science. What they're doing is they're looking at already the existing data, the existing science which is out there. They collate that together and come out with broad trends. And then every country sort of deliberates, and there's just like the climate change, the UNFCCC, which you see where a lot of politics plays out. Even in the IPCC reports, there's a lot of politics. Should we use adaptation here? Should we use mitigation over here? What is the broad, overall pattern that is being suggested for this country? There's a lot of fighting which goes on, even behind closed doors, as far as the IPCC reports are concerned. And I'm saying this, that in spite of the fact that there is all this politics, what we're finding is that more and more the IPCC reports are unequivocal in terms of what they're saying. What they're saying now is the science is clear. The time for climate denial, the time for climate skepticism is over. Coming back to your specific question on the wet bulb temperature, I think the best analogy to give really is that when a child is running high fever, what do we do in India particularly? I think we do it. We put wet handkerchiefs on that person's forehead just to bring the temperature down. So what is happening in that? Basically, the body sweat evaporates and it cools the temperatures down. So in this case, in the IPCC report, what they've done is they've taken into account the wet bulb thermometer. So very simply, when you put a wet cloth on the bulb of the thermometer, what are the impacts as far as heat and humidity are concerned? So we're not just looking at temperatures in isolation, we're looking at the impact of humidity and heat on the human body. And what they've said very simply is that while up to 31 degrees is perhaps what the body can tolerate, but beyond that is where it can get fatal. That is the ability of the body to bring down its temperatures just by evaporation. That is now proving to be, if somebody is out in the sun for more than 6 hours and the temperatures are above 35 degrees, the wet bulb temperatures, then that can prove to be fatal. And that's scary. I mean, we've just come out of a pandemic, and I think these are no longer doom and gloom scenarios. We've seen it. We are in the midst of a heat wave right now. So I think the time for action needs to step up now.
Right. And Bahar, to that end, also, specifically the challenges that India and the Indian subcontinent face. From what I understand, the IPCC report, perhaps for the first time, is looking at sort of a region specific.
Yes.
So could you give us a broad sort of understanding of what is it that the report talks about us and our
Yes.
neighbors?
Smita, I will talk about it, but again with the rider that I think all climate conversations end up in a doomsday scenario. So yes, the IPCC, what it says is scary, and what they've been saying is very scary, and I think that disengages the viewer. And what I would like to do is couch this in a more positive language, which is that yes, the IPCC has said that temperatures in Ahmedabad, Chennai, Patna, Bihar, I mean, they've named the states and how bad things are going to be. And anybody can Google that and look that up. And I don't want to sort of play it out and scare people more. But what are we asking? What we're asking for is adaptation strategy. So what the IPCC is saying is we will need to adapt to the fact that temperatures are rising. So how can we do that? We can do that by having cities that are more sustainable. We can do that by having cities that provide more green cover. We can do that by providing, infrastructure in cities that reduces pollution. Now, climate change or no climate change, why should we not aspire to have this in our cities? Why should we not aspire to make our cities more livable? So I would like to couch whatever the IPCC has said in a more positive way, because I think that becomes more aspirational. And you want to live in a city which has less pollution. You want to live in a city which relies less on fossil fuels. And of course, you're right, that's easier easier said than done, because that brings us to the issue of equity. And I'll talk more about that. But let's talk about urban infrastructure. So here's an example from Ahmedabad. You know what they've tried doing is they've started cooling the roofs by painting them white. And they found that the heat island effect goes down. So what are heat islands? These are typically patches in cities where the temperatures are higher than usual. Why? Because there are no green patches available there. So the chances of people suffering from ailments is going to be much higher. What they've done in Ahmedabad is, for instance, they've started giving heat alerts, saying today the temperature is going to be so much at 3 in the afternoon, please don't step out. So I think some adaptation is starting in cities, and many more cities now need to tune into this.
Right. About these, you said you're couching it in a sort of let's look at what we can do sort of approach. But I want to ask you about what has that sort of commitment been now? For our viewers, the first IPCC, those unfamiliar with this, assessment report was released in 1990. Since then, we have had five reports. Now, these are all comprehensive scientific evaluations, as Bahar told us a little earlier. Basically, the point being that the science has been around for decades now. What has always been found wanting is the commitment and the political will, particularly that of developed nations. Now, I remember having a brief conversation with you when you were in Glasgow for COP26, Bahar. You were in Paris too, if I'm not wrong. You had
Yes.
reported from Paris as well. Now, can you give us a sort of nut graph understanding of Glasgow and after, how that has shaped up? The subject of equity that you can, if you can perhaps reflect on a little more, and after which, if you can tell us about India's commitments and how you see that play out.
Absolutely. So before we come to Glasgow, I think I should also mention that there's always this tussle between adaptation and mitigation. And I also teach the narratives on climate change at a university. And, this is something
Can
which
you
my
tell us the
students
difference?
often ask me. Yes, so that's what I was coming to. That there is, imagine you're in a boat and the boat develops a hole and you're going to sink. So adaptation, very simply, would be that you take basically just a bucket and start throwing the water out. And mitigation would be you try and repair that hole. You'll probably have to do both. And policymakers always debate on should we put all our money in adapting, because climate change is going to happen and the world is never going to get its act together. And so, therefore, let's simply focus on adaptation. But the developing world is saying, no, we need to mitigate, you need to cut down your emissions. And incidentally, that's why I bring up the topic of equity. We are talking right now about historical emissions. And I know I'm now getting into technical jargon, but very simply, what exists in the atmosphere right now, which is causing global warming, is because of the release of greenhouse gases, which the developed world released, 50 to 100 years ago. Now, you may ask, what is that still doing in the atmosphere? Well, CO2 doesn't go away that easily. Neither does methane. Water vapor, perhaps may, but most of these gases tend to stay in the atmosphere. And who's responsible for this hot mess that we are in currently? It's the developed world. Has the developed world paid up anything at all when they come to these UN conventions? No, they haven't. So, given this background, now I'd like to answer your question on what really happened at Glasgow. Some people call it a washout, some people call it just about imagine that somebody's on a ventilator in the ICU. So, we're just about keeping that person alive. And that person at the moment is planet Earth. Sorry to slip into this doomsday scenario, but I think one can't mince any words anymore. But there was also some progress made. Countries agreed to come together to cut down 30% of their methane emissions. There were some talks, multilateral talks about halting deforestation, also about cutting subsidies to fossil fuels. Where countries disagreed was how to end coal. And this is where India comes in, because there was a lot of pressure on India to cut down coal, because remember, nearly 40% of global emissions come from coal. But here's the hypocrisy of it all, which is that oil and gas which are also fossil fuels, which the EU, for instance, relies on, that never comes up for discussion. That's never on the table. So this is where I slipped from being an environment journalist reporting from planet Earth to bringing in the issue of equity, because we don't talk about this, and we kind of make India to into this villain of the piece because it's not cutting down on coal. India is doing a lot. So if you were to ask me what is India doing, I think we need to do much more, especially as an environment journalist. I would say more on biodiversity and deforestation. I think these are two tracks we should work on more. But given how little the developed world has put on the table, I think we're doing quite a bit. Is that enough for catastrophic global warming to be stopped? No, it isn't. We are just about on track for keeping temperatures below 3 degrees. We're now at the moment we are headed towards 2.7 degrees. What can we do? I think that would be the right question to ask. What can we do? We need to cut our emissions at least by 30 to 40% by 2030. 45%, sorry. The last figures was 45% by 2030. That's what the world needs to do to bring down emissions, to not have these heat waves, and to live in a better world, very simply.
Right. That would have been a good way to end, Bahar. But I have to ask you a question specifically on the commitments that India made at COP26. And I was hoping to have that conversation, and we couldn't sort of. I remember speaking to Smitha Nair about it, a day before it
Yes,
sort of became public, and she said we are anticipating the commitment to when we get to net zero emissions, and the commitment
yes,
to move towards non-fossil fuel. Many sort of editorials seem to
yes,
suggest that it was rather ambitious. Do
yes.
you see us doing it? I mean, do you see that happening?
Well, the Prime Minister announced at Glasgow that we're aiming for it by 2070, and the BBC put out a headline saying 2070 is too late. And here we are within our limited capacities, domestically discussing if even that's enough. The Prime Minister also made an announcement about 40% reliance on non-fossil fuels. So, but none of this has been submitted as actual. NDC. So we're still, as you said, we're still waiting for the actual announcement. But the Prime Minister did what he called the punch Amritam, which he announced over there. I would consider them, yes, as highly ambitious and aspirational. But again, to explain to viewers, none of this is legally binding. What happened in Glasgow was these are voluntary commitments. So what countries have said is here's what we'll try and do. But I think because India is on track, at least for Paris, for its Paris commitments, yes, we should do it. But that doesn't mean that the developed world shouldn't put more money on the table. I think that if the developed world were to put more money on the table, then India could even get to net zero earlier. There are studies to show that that there are predictions, modeling predictions to show that if money is put on the table, India could accelerate to net zero even before 2070, as outlined by the Prime Minister.
All right, Bahar. Perhaps this is something we can continue to track with you on Weekly Fix in the sort of months ahead. For the moment, Bahar,
Absolutely.
thanks so much for sort of breaking down what many consider to be a sort of a complicated subject with jargon sometimes that goes above one's head. For the
Yes.
moment, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. Bye bye.